You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast, and please remember, rate and review us on iTunes and tweet us at BHPhotoVideo with the hashtag BHPhotoPodcast. We recently traveled to the distant corner of 34th Street and 8th Avenue, New York City, to the OPTIC 2016 Imaging Conference. OPTIC presents the best in nature and landscape photography and was filled with presentations by many outstanding photographers. The show was sponsored by B&H Photo and was free to the public. In future episodes, we'll present our conversations with Ralph Lee Hopkins, Brenda Tharp, Flip Nicklin, Erica Larson, and others. But today, we bring you two incredible conversations with undeniable legends of the medium. Our first chat is with the keynote speaker of OPTIC 2016, Michael Kenna, and next we sit down with father and son, Paul and John Paul Caponigro. A master of composition and long exposure, Michael Kenna is known primarily for his medium format black and white landscape photography. He spoke of the relationship he feels with his inanimate subjects and the role that chance can play in even the most composed of photographs. Personally speaking, his work just floors me. We're being joined now by Michael Kenna, who was the keynote speaker this morning and an amazingly refreshing photographer. I can go on for hours about his work, but we'll try to...
Yeah, please do. Then I don't have to speak. It's fine.
I also might say you have excellent choice in eyeglass frames.
I was just going to agree on yours too. Yes.
If you're not familiar with Michael's work, it's really amazing. A lot of predominantly black and white. He's a film shooter. When you get down to the basics of design, one of the truisms is that you keep taking away, getting closer, till you get down to the bare elements. And that's one of the things that just strikes me about your work is that almost invariably, your work is down to the bare design elements. Anything more would ruin it. Anything less, same thing. You're at the perfect balance. And I think it's also interesting that you really prefer, even though you've used digital, you still prefer to shoot film. And something that I learned on film. I started on 4x5 a million years ago, and 2 years ago started shooting film again to improve my digital, just for the discipline aspect. But you really rely on it, and one of the things that you kept coming back to is that when you're shooting, you really never know what you're going home with. And that to me is a magical thing that is lost to a lot of people.
Can you tell us the kind of maybe a rundown over the years, some of the cameras you've used and why you made switches
or didn't make switches?
Or didn't make switches,
yes. I have to remember, I started off with basically the cheapest camera, a good camera I could find, which was a Voigtlander viewfinder camera when I went to art school. Mm-hmm. When I go back even further now, and I had a plastic Diana camera in my boarding school days, which I did use, and have some very interesting bad photographs from. But the Voigtlander was my first serious camera, if I can say that. And then I moved from that into Pentax, Praktikas. At some point I moved to, I think it was a Mamiya or something 2.25 camera. I can't remember, but then I lost it. And then I went into Nikon and got all sorts of different Nikons. And eventually I moved to Hasselblad, basically, which is where I've stayed since the mid-'80s. I would say the first 15 years of my career I've used 35mm predominantly. Mm-hmm. And even in 35mm, just the decision-making process of whether it should be horizontal or vertical began to be slightly annoying.
I was going to ask you whether it was the larger negative that attracted you to the Hasselblad or medium format in general, or was it this square picture?
I think generally, if I look back, when photography has got to the point where I know what I'm getting, I lose some of the interest in it. And when I was doing 35mm photography, it coincided with my kind of adventures into night photography also. And then I pushed myself into night photography. One of the reasons was because I didn't really want to know what I was getting. I wanted some of that unpredictability back. When photographers start, they have an absolute love affair with what they're doing. And I think as they go on and on and on, they reach certain plateaus. And then you really have to push through very, very hard to get to the next plateau. Sometimes that takes many hours, days, weeks, months and years, and a lot of us photographers don't want to do that. We want kind of instant results almost. And you have to fight against that. At least I've always found that I had to fight against that. I moved into 2.25 primarily because I was getting a little upset with the predictability of 35 millimeter. I knew what I was doing. I knew what. It's almost the opposite of the Ansel Adams theory that when you photograph, you should know exactly how you're going to print it. My way has always been the reverse of that. I really don't.
So you
want
get nervous
to know.
when you start getting comfortable.
Exactly. Yes, I do.
Interesting.
And I moved into 2.25. First of all, just with a waist level viewfinder because it was back to front. It immediately upset all my, my knowledge. On the first series of work I made, I printed 16 by 20. I made large prints because they were very graphic and they were the reverse of what I would normally see. They were almost Asian in style, in some strange way. After about a year of that, I actually found a prism finder, and so at least now I can look through the viewfinder and photograph the correct way, or the right way.
Did you find that working reversed, which is what happens when you look through the viewfinder of a 4x5 or a Hasselblad or anything that doesn't have a prism on it, did that sharpen your sense of composition? Because your sense of composition is dead on. I mean, it's really phenomenal. And I found my experience is that when you look at something reversed or flipped upside down and backwards, it becomes objective rather than subjective. And now you're just looking at the shapes and the shadows and the lines.
Yes, exactly.
Did you find that true?
Yes, very true. And certainly when I was using the viewfinder, I would often purposely, it sounds weird, but purposely look out of focus. I would blur my eyes so that I could just see shapes. Objects, what is touching the edges. And when I print everything myself. I find that very, very important. When I print images, often I print them upside down. And I print them upside down for a reason, because I can see it much more objectively. It's not a house, it's not a tree, it's just a dark form in a composition. And essentially, as photographers, we are trying to communicate something, and we are trying to attract an audience to look at the image. And there are ways of doing that. In a sense, you can manipulate a viewer into looking at your work. You can guide the viewer into certain areas of your work. You could make areas important or less important, more significant, less significant, whether it's in terms of contrast, black and white, composition, or cropping. There's lots of ways of doing it.
Do you I know you shoot film. That's your preference. I mean, what about your prints? You go from start to finish. You carry the whole process
Everything,
through.
Yes.
Are you printing traditional darkroom, or are you converting your negatives to?
No, all traditional darkroom.
It is. So
yes.
Okay.
No, I understand that you can get negatives made and digitally retouched and so forth, but again, there's something about it that just it doesn't interest me. It's I know it sounds almost trite to say it's too easy, but it is too easy. When on the computer, when you can digitally change things and move things around and take things out, and I have a collection of photographs, and the prints that really fascinate me are the ones where I feel the presence of the artist. So I have a Giacomelli, for example, where he's used a felt tip marker to actually, black out certain areas. I have Bill Brandt, where you can see his retouching. I like the kind of that patina, that presence of the artist. I don't like it to be mechanical.
Well, you made a point during your talk about perfection and your desire to kind of avoid it when possible. And it reminded me of that phrase, which I love, which is perfection is the opposite of good. And I mean, I love this, and I find that with or without choice, that's pretty much my life in a nutshell. But I love to hear that, especially in this day and age where we're always striving, at least digitally, for these ideal images and to appreciate the mistakes and appreciate the accidents.
You want to see the presence of life. You want to sense a certain sense of history of what has gone before.
Yeah. Absolutely. Can you speak a bit about the process then? Is your darkroom at your home?
Yes, the darkroom's in my home.
Okay.
Basically, in the basement, I have a full studio because I have 40 plus years of negatives, of prints, and I have an in-house darkroom.
And do you print every day, or do you kind of do it over?
No, it's
push it together.
I mean, printing is actually quite a demanding physical process. So sometimes I print 3 or 4 days on the stretch, and
then that's
my body hurts.
You're cooked. It's like signing books.
Yes,
It's
not easy, but it's. I mean, there is something absolutely magical that being in the darkroom. You lose all sense of time, and you're there alone. I often listen to books on tape, and for me, a negative is very much like a piece of clay or a substance. It's something you can work with. It's not something again, it goes back to, post-visualization, pre-visualization. How do you want to do that? For me, I like to go into the darkroom completely objective, making a print and then playing with it. And I can play with it for 3, 4, or 5 hours before I have what I consider to be an interesting print. Mm-hmm. And that interesting print is a personal print. I often say if I gave the negative to somebody else, hopefully they would come out with a completely different print.
Sure.
And that's the way it should be.
Well, it's like sheet music. If you can have 10 people who are very accomplished musicians, you give each of them the same piece of sheet music, you're going to hear a different melody. You're going to hear different nuances and stuff like that. So
yes.
It's the same thing with that.
Yes.
But are you frustrated by the shrinking availability of chemical of
well,
film
yes,
and
course.
chemistry and paper?
Yes.
What is what kind of paper, specifically what paper are you using these days? Because I know that really got hit.
I use Ilford Multigrade.
Okay.
I've been using it since the mid-'80s. I was part of the pilot project when they were first testing it.
Oh, so
and
you
I've
know
remained
this product.
faithful ever since because I also tone it slightly, just a sepia tone in the highlights. And I've done this a long, long time. I know it inside out. Probably I could use other papers if I had to. I've often said, if all the materials disappeared, then I would probably have to go digital. It wouldn't be the end of the world, if I still have my health. If you put things in perspective, it's not such a huge issue, actually. But as long as it's available, it's like using an old guitar or something that's familiar with that you really enjoy, I will continue doing the same thing. I have experimented many times with digital prints, I have to say. And I have never found a digital print that I love. I just can't. And that's a completely personal thing. The thousands and thousands of photographers who are completely happy, satisfied with digital prints. I'm not. And that's something perhaps lacking in me, but as long as I can print silver prints, I infinitely prefer them.
Well, if you can, why not?
Yeah.
It's also something about the fact that the no silver print is actually identical to the next one.
Yes.
It's just not possible.
That's true. That's very,
whereas,
very true.
Once you get one digital print, you press that button again, and you can get identical print, second time, third time, fourth time.
My question before was, do you, in the sense that when you want to go into the dark room and you want to be fresh and objective to some degree, do you purposely wait a period of time after you've shot a series or a selection to go into the dark room, or not necessarily?
Well, that's my preference.
It is.
Yeah. I mean, in life, it doesn't always work out that way because, perhaps you have an exhibition, perhaps you have a book, some commission, or, commercial. You don't know what you're doing. So sometimes, I showed work, that I printed literally a couple of weeks ago.
During your presentation, you paid homage to many classic photographers, names that we all know. Were you also influenced by painters or sculptors, or because you went to art school, and I imagine you were bombarded with stuff? Who are some of the painters or illustrators or sculptors that have sort of stuck out to you?
I mean, there are so many. It's impossible to name almost. Turner was certainly highly influential to begin with his atmospheric, with his light, with his blurring of details, with his obscuring of actually what is happening. Constable, the Impressionists, the Japanese printmakers. I mean, just wonderful.
There's just soak it all in.
There's too many. I think to find your vision, it's that old saying. To find yourself, you have to stand on the shoulders of giants, basically.
Yes.
Otherwise, you end up redoing the wheel. And certainly, when I was younger, I went to art school. I studied history of art many times, and I studied the history of photography. And there are certain image makers that you are attracted to, and others you're not.
Right.
And it's very simple. And then you begin to analyze why. There's vast amounts of photographers out there that don't leave very much impression on me. It's not because they're not brilliant, great, wonderful photographers. They're not my photography somehow. But there are some photographers who may not be particularly in the stellar orbits of the photography world that touch me. They're very, very profound. And those are the ones you have to really connect to, I think.
You've done some very, very good commercial work for, you mentioned like Land Rover and BMW and some high-profile advertising. But you went to school for fine art, and your work is obviously fine art, the work that you do.
I mean, that's actually not accurate. I did go to art school, and then I went to a photography school, which was primarily commercial. I studied to be, as I said, I studied to be a fashion photographer, a food photographer, an advertising photographer, a car photographer, every sort of photographer. They equipped you, supposedly, when you left, you could survive. That was my whole ideal. I needed to survive. I didn't have any safety net. I come from a very poor working class background. I needed to survive in England. I would have loved to have been a painter. I knew at that age, 19 years old, 18, I wouldn't survive. I'd be brushing the floor and cleaning gutters, and I just knew it.
That's like when I went to the High School of Art and Design for Sculpture. I knew that I'm not going to be raising a family and making pots and clay animals, and I fell in love with photography, and there you go.
Yeah.
I get it.
So I when I left photography school, I worked on Fleet Street selling images to newspapers, and it was for Magnum, which was amazing. I didn't realize at the time I had in my hands boxes of Lartigues, Cartier-Bressons, Bruno Barbie, just all these amazing photographers that I was seeing every day, and they were, they go into your senses without you even consciously doing it. And then I'd have to go to the Times and the Telegraph and the Daily Mail, trying to sell these photographs from Gamma and Sigma, and obviously it wasn't my profession. I'm not very good at sales. So after about 7 months, then I got a job working as an advertising assistant and a black and white printmaker for Anthony Blake.
Ah, okay.
So I kind of continued my commercial world, but at the same time, then I went to New York at a certain point. The end of my studies, I came as an exchange student. I worked in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountains. I made beds, mowed the lawn, cleaned the pool. All the stuff you do when you're a student.
Sure.
That's the apprentice program, at B&H.
Yes, that's perfect.
It's the same thing.
Can I ask, regarding the commercial work you do, is your process the same? Do you do all the printing, and do you check all your contact sheets?
It's probably primarily the reason I don't do very much commercial work now is that everything is now digital. You have, it's so international that creative directors across the world and clients, they want to see things instantly. They want to put their type on it. They want to lay them out, send it here, there, and everywhere. And I tell them, well, I'll photograph, and then I have to get the film processed, and then I have to make the contact sheets, and then the work prints, and
And they're already texting somebody else at that point, right?
Exactly. Yes. So they, if I do get hired, they want particularly my vision, which is a slow way of working. For the most part, in commercial work, they will scan the negative, particularly in cars, because they always end up retouching them.
Sure.
Sometimes the image you don't even recognize as your own after a while.
So you'll be done with it at the image stage, or at the negative stage?
It varies. It varies. If it's a car commercial, I would go to the lab and they would retouch it in front of me. But if it's, the recent one for HSBC, they wanted it basically Michael Kenna vision.
Okay.
And almost nothing was retouched in that.
And
they worked from prints that
you submitted prints that you made. Okay.
So it varies from company to company.
Now, yesterday at this time, you were in a monastery in France, and now we are in Midtown Manhattan.
Indeed.
Now, you were showing us photographs taken at the very, very top spire of that. And one of the things that was getting me, did you take those pictures yesterday? Because if you did, that means that you had to develop the film and print them in the bathroom on the jet flying over here. And I love that picture in my head of somebody locked in the bathroom, developing film and making prints so they could show them the next day in Manhattan. Please tell me you did that.
It is a nice thought. And in my earlier years, I did travel around with my own darkroom in the back of the car, basically. I would process, the photograph I showed of the swings in 1977 in the Catskill Mountains. That was I processed that in a hotel sink, basically. But nowadays, no, I don't do that. That's too difficult.
Now, what about the restrictions of flying right now with X-rays and all the other things that are going on there? Isn't it a little bit more trepidating having to travel carrying film, which is so sensitive to a lot of the security measures that are going on in airports, especially if you're going from one place to another with multiple? I mean, how do you get around that? How do you deal with that? How do you protect your film?
It's awful, to be honest. That is one of the big drawbacks of using film is actually transporting it. Depending on where I am, if I'm photographing in Japan, I buy the film in Japan and I have it processed in Japan by a lab.
Okay.
Or if I'm in New York, I'd buy it here, I'd have it processed here. If I'm in France, I do the same. So I try to avoid X-rays as much as possible.
I have a friend that FedExes all this film ahead of him and then FedExes it back to just bypass.
But even
airport.
FedEx, they can go through.
They do spot X-rays,
Yes.
but chances are you're okay.
Right.
But again, it's things we used to take for granted are difficult.
It's very difficult. And I recently had a whole batch of film in Japan and also in Laos. Where in the highlights, in the grey highlights, you can actually see the numbers of the film and Kodak written backwards on all of them.
I was going to ask you if that ever happened, but I didn't want to upset you if it was an upsetting situation.
Well, apparently it was defective film, though, because the lab in Tokyo said they'd seen it from a number of photographers.
Okay.
So you have to deal with that sometimes, and it just means that each print, requires 2 hours of retouching.
Are you ever attracted to any of the alternative processes?
I mean, they're all wonderful. I literally find that if I could clone myself 2 or 3 times, there would be a lot more I could accomplish in this life.
That's why you had kids, right?
Yes, I know.
Ooh, yeah, that's right.
So yes, I would love to try everything, but in reality, it's not going to happen. I've had platinum prints made.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say that I've ever really been happy with them. They're fine. For me, they're not as good as silver prints. I suppose, as I say, it's like if you have a musical instrument and you've played it for 40 years, and you can get the best new musical instrument, and it's just not the same.
It's just a different medium.
Yes.
It's not your medium.
Right.
That actually reminds me. I was trying to formulate a question while I was listening to you talk about music, and the relationship between your photos and music, and I really couldn't think of anything to say, but you brought it up here. Is there anything in that? Do you find something musical about the work you do? Do you see connections between music and your photographic process to some degree?
Music is so abstract, and it's so emotive. It touches us in certain places, and I like to think photography can be also abstract. It's difficult because with photography, you're always tied to reality. It's as David was saying, and I strongly agree, one of the drawbacks of this movement, this stampede to digital, is that you can't believe anything anymore. Mm-hmm. No photograph makes sense.
Yeah, I read a quote
real.
of yours recently, something along those lines. I don't believe anything anymore. Is that what you said?
It's true. Yeah. It's true, which is a shame, because I think that tied to reality was the almost the most powerful aspect of photography, that you could be dealing with something on an abstract level, in a rectangle with various shapes and tonalities. It's very, very abstract. And yet, at the same time, there is attachment to reality. Painting is not the same, because painting is a bit like Photoshop. You can paint and add something and change something or whatever else. Sculpture is not the same. All of these mediums are not the same, which doesn't really answer your question about music, but...
No, it's okay. I didn't really have much of a question. It just it came to me. Do you like Van Morrison by any chance?
Oh, yes, very much.
Okay,
yes.
All right. There was something you said, and I thought, wow, that sounds like some Van Morrison talking right there.
Could be, yes.
Anyway, but, you spoke a lot about what we're doing a show soon called Collaborating with Chance, and the idea of how much chance is tied into the work that you ultimately get. You talked a lot about the masters that you maybe not emulate, but you're influenced by. And you even talked about the love of errors that you find and the imperfections. All that to say that it seems like you distance yourself a little bit from the great work that you are doing somehow. Is that fair to say? And if it is, what is it that Michael Kenna brings to this process as an individual?
No, I don't think I distance myself from it. I'm very well aware of where I stand and what I do. I've always felt that photographers tend to take themselves a little too seriously, as if they're actually creating something. And I really do believe that we are...
I love it.
As if you created something.
No, I really do think that we are mediums very much. We are, as I said, I tried to explain that when you see something, beautiful out there, and you're photographing it, you're not the author. You are photographing something beautiful. And the more and more technology gets to the point where it's so automatic, you just press a button, in 15 frames a second, the less and less, in a sense, you are the author. You're just recording what he's already created.
We as photographers, we are those that recognize. Mm-hmm. So is that somehow to describe it? You recognize the beauty, you recognize, and you form the shape around it?
Well, in some ways, we're editors also.
Yeah.
I often say we see so much all the time, three-dimensional colors, different senses, and we're trying to make selections of what is somehow significant, important, and is worthy of communication. But you have to have a certain humbleness to do that, as well as a certain ego, because you're saying, yes, I'm making the selection. But you also have to say, yes, but I am just the medium. You can't be the point where you say, I am the creator. That doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. So I don't distance myself from what I'm doing. I try to do as much as I can do. There's my favorite soccer team in England is Everton. And their motto is nil satis nisi optimum, which means in Latin, nothing but the best is good enough, which is what we as humans should be striving for at all times in all levels of our existence. Mm-hmm. I, as a photographer, strive for that.
A big gripe I have with a lot of photographers, and there are a few people I know of personally that I have trouble with it. They go through great expense and distance to capture photographs that everybody else has already taken. They'll go to the parks, all this. They'll travel for 2 or 3 days and get up at, to take a picture, to stand on the same pile of rocks that countless other people have stood on top, and probably left and right of them do the same, to capture the same picture everyone else has. And I don't get that from you. Have you found yourself in a situation where you go, that's amazing, but wait a minute, it's been done already, and you turn around?
Many times. I mean, it happens all the time, but as I was trying to explain to somebody earlier, the fact that you have a camera and somebody else has a camera doesn't mean that you have that much in common. It's like somebody who has a pencil and somebody else has a pencil. Michelangelo had a pencil. My accountant has a pencil. What have they got in common? It's the same with cameras, I think. So yes, some people just love to travel. Some people came over before, one person came over before and said, I listened to 5 minutes of your lecture, but I'm really only interested in cameras, so I walked out. But it's okay.
Yes.
We all have our proclivities, our obsessions, our interests, and I think that makes the world a very interesting place. So yes, somebody, if they have the money, they can spend all this time and effort and go to the place and try to get a duplicate of somebody else. I remember bumping into, I'd rather not mention names, but a photographer who'd basically spent the last 10 years wandering around in footsteps of other photographers, including my own. And he was so proud that he had photographs that looked exactly like mine. Just exactly. He'd gone to the same place and photographed in the same manner, used Photoshop to make it exactly. But he was so proud. But that was his way of working. And it's far. I can't judge him and say, well, that's not relevant, because that's what he enjoys doing.
Some years ago, I stepped into a hardware store near my house, and I happened to have a shirt that had a Kodak logo on it. And the guy behind the counter was early 20s, and he goes, "Are you a photographer?" I go, "Yeah." He goes, "Can I show you a picture I just took?" Sure. And he takes out a little yellow Kodak. This is actually years ago. And he takes out a perfect picture, and it was taken at like SeaWorld, of one of the orca whales jumping out, taking the fish out of the trainer's hand with an out-of-focus audience behind. Yeah. It was a perfect photograph. And I said, "You took this picture?" He goes, "Yeah." I go, "It's a wonderful photograph." He goes, "I thought so. It was a billboard."
That is great.
And he was so proud of himself that he took a perfect picture of this billboard, and he's proud.
Yes. Well, if you had a very famous...
I take pictures of billboards.
If you had a very famous name, you could probably sell it for a lot of money as a good appropriation.
Yeah, right.
I'm sure there's some postmodernist concept behind that.
Yes, and that's a topic for another show. There we go.
Totally.
Oh, well. Okay.
Do you shoot... I'm sorry, last question. Do you shoot up in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest? Or not much?
I'm beginning to, yes.
Yeah,
I find it difficult, actually. I've always found it difficult to photograph around where I live.
Near your home.
Only because of the logistics.
Mm-hmm.
There's things to do, children to take to school, spend time, with the family. There's bills to pay. There's telephone. There's just stuff, always stuff. It's very difficult to step away from that stuff.
Well, that's like you mentioned, being in a monastery for several days, and there's silence.
Exactly.
I got what you're talking about there.
But you need to take yourself out of your routine, your day-to-day, and get into...
It's difficult to say, I've got 3 hours, let me go out and be creative. Yeah. Because I often say, you don't know if you're going to be there 5 seconds, 5 days, 5 years. Whether you have to respond to individual creative events. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to do on a schedule. So for my part, I say, this week, this 2 weeks, I'm going to this place. Sometimes if it's in Asia, it's with a guide to help me deal with all these logistics that I don't want to deal with. Finding hotels in the middle of Japan is not easy. And then I'm happy if my assistants leave me alone, just completely. When I do commercial work, I trained my assistant, because I do long exposures, I trained my assistant to tell the client and the art director that I was counting of the long exposure. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I could set up a tripod, not even be photographing, and walk around, and everybody left me alone completely. And that was the way to photograph. People respect distance. They're not always conversing and saying, well, what if he did this, and how about that, and what do you think of that picture? And because you can't think straight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great takeaway. Great takeaway. Well, Michael Kenna, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, great
Wonderful,
pleasure.
wonderful work. Pleasure talking with you, seeing your work.
Thank you.
Very
Great
well.
to be here. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo, hashtag BHPhotoPodcast.
It's kind of serendipitous that we present this conversation with Paul and John Paul Caponigro as Father's Day approaches. In addition to a wonderful conversation on the nature of art and spirituality, we also talked about parenting and raising a creative child. Paul Caponigro is recognized as one of America's foremost landscape and still life photographers. His work is imbued with spirit and wonder. A master of technique, John Paul is an environmental fine art landscape photographer whose unique work blends photographic and painterly qualities to create haunting and beautiful land and seascapes. We are back at OPTIC 2016. This is a treat. I've been in photography. September will be 50 years that I started taking pictures, and here I am sitting across the table from Paul Caponigro and John Paul Caponigro. And this is like a true treat. Before we start talking, I just want to tell you something really quickly. Yesterday evening, we were walking in front of the store. I bumped into you guys, and I don't know whether you picked it up, but a lot of people are stopping and turning and pointing. And the last time I saw that kind of buzz was when Russell Crowe was walking in front of the store. So that's what it is. You guys, the antennas go up and the buzz starts, and it was really magical to see that, and you guys deserve it. It's great to have you here, and I think something we really need to talk about would be old and new, because photography just went through a big transition, and between your work, what was back then, the 60s, 70s through now, has seen a huge transition too. I understand you were at the Met today looking at old artwork.
We did.
Any thoughts about that?
Well, so many thoughts. I was floored that my dad had not seen that collection yet. It's been a little while since he's been up to the Met. But the Rockefeller wing has these beautiful oceanic artifacts, but then also things from around the world. South American, the African things are really quite fetching this morning. There's a kind of a primal spirit to the way that these people make what we consider art. I'm not sure that they always considered it art. I read a wonderful book called The Primal Mind by a Native American historian that said a lot of these cultures don't have a word for art. They just consider it an effervescence of spirit.
Interesting.
And boy, is there a lot of spirit in that room.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing.
So I was delighted to see Dad's reactions to so many of my favorite artworks and some new things that he would tuned into.
Well, to be in the presence of that much of that oceanic art was a real surprise to me. Whoever collected that stuff brought it there and then assembled it. It has even a greater impact. You meet a couple of individual pieces and it's pretty exciting, but to have that room concentrated with that kind of power, I'm glad he brought me. I mean, I'm even almost happy that I came to New York City.
Is that said with a Boston accent or no?
Sorry?
No. Where's home? Where were you born and raised?
Boston?
That's what I thought.
You got it. You nailed it.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah,
just wanted
you
to be
nailed
sure
it.
about that. Okay.
Well, he's tried really hard to get rid of that accent.
Okay.
And done a very good job. I'm impressed that you picked it up.
Well,
Shame
I guess
on
it was
you.
the hate of New York that came through more than the accent itself.
I love New York.
But
Born in Boston, but I like to say that I was conceived in New York.
Well, you were.
We'll have your dad ask him to talk about that maybe. But can you kind of take what Alan was getting at and the visit to the Met and talk a little bit in terms of your work and maybe what you're seeing even today and yesterday when Michael Kenna spoke and Paul's work and what connections or diversions you see in
and I'll start it out.
contemporary
I'd
photography.
love to see where he takes it.
Absolutely.
Dad said something as we were flying down about his experience in China recently, which is a big thing for him to go all the way to China for that many weeks. And the people over there that were working with him asked him, well, how do I make more beautiful photographs? I said, well, you need to be more beautiful.
Yeah.
It reminded me like Jay Maisel saying, you want to take more interesting photographs? Be more interesting. But I think the art that we experienced this morning was definitely an extension of a way of being. It wasn't just cleverly crafted objects. It wasn't just craft. It was charged with life still. Many of those people are probably not with us today, but there's life in those objects. They're not just clever or well crafted. They're endowed with spirit, and how that gets into stuff and how it persists long after we're gone, that's one of the big mysteries for me, and one of the reasons I keep going.
You just said something about spirit, and I think that's something that's very strong in both of your work, in that there is a certain, I hate these words, spirituality. I mean, I'm putting something out there, but there's a certain...
Why are you uncomfortable? So many people are uncomfortable. Like Michael Kenna was dancing around it recently as well.
Yes, he was, actually. I was there. Yes, you're right about that.
I dance around it all the time as well, because
I think we put a connotation. We put a connotation on it that way.
Right. We think somebody's pushing their religion on us.
Exactly. But spirituality is something that is inside of you. It's I think, the spark of life of each of us. And when you do landscape and you do the kind of work that both of you are known for, that's something that comes through. Do you feel that that's missing from a lot of the photographs today? It's come to a point, I mean, a photography, what we consider good photography, I think the standards have gone down in many, many ways. Not that there's not a lot of very good photography, but do you think there's lacking a spirituality or soul?
The art usually reflects the times.
Yeah.
And it's the times that's giving what you think is degradation or a downhill slope on the art itself. It's an expression of the times. I was telling my son John this morning, there's art and there's self-expression. And the ancients knew art. They lived art. They understood that the essential part of doing the art was spirit. Self-expression today is rampant in the streets, but it doesn't have the essence of their own spirit. They don't even express themselves. They don't even know themselves. So there's a big problem there, I divide it. Art, self-expression. Anyone who tries to express themselves, if they could just taste the power of an exhibition like the Oceanic and sense that that's in themselves, they have a chance to transcend mere self-expression.
Wow, that was...
Good night, everybody.
Can you imagine, 50 years at dinner at the table with a guy like this? No. Pretty fantastic.
Pretty fantastic quote. Idea. Can we find where that line is between the two? Can we find it personally, and can we find it in someone else's work? How do we find it?
I think we can definitely find it.
We can't point to it, maybe, but
how we can agree
Mm-hmm.
among each other when it's happening and when it's not, that's a much more challenging discussion. But you can definitely get a taste for it, learn to enter into it more frequently, and grow it. It's a faculty, just like creativity is a muscle, and you flex it and you grow stronger at it. It's the same with being there, like any form of meditation that will help you tune in. And it doesn't have to be denominational or religious or within a current spiritual practice. It can be. But I think people steer away from these notions of spirituality because so many people have tried to impose their religion on someone else, where really we need to acknowledge that, as you said very well, I think, that we're all spiritual beings and we have different ways of contacting that, connecting with that, and growing that, being alive in that. And to be able to share that would be wonderful. I don't think that our culture makes enough space for that, and I don't think that we have a clear enough discussion about it. I'm not sure that things have devolved. I think the value structure has shifted, and we really have left something behind which I think would revitalize us in so many ways if we reclaimed.
Interesting.
Can I ask when regarding this sense of spirituality and your work, do you look for those moments or find those moments when you're actually creating the photographs? Is it kind of all about that, or is it something that you find more when the final product is there, when the work is created?
For me, it's an aspect of being that I recognize when I'm truly present and when I really get lit up. Let's avoid the enlightenment pun.
Okay, yeah.
When I feel that I'm truly alive and present and feeling something, all of it is engaged, tend to make better work. Often it surprises me. And I think part of what Dad was getting at about the self-expression is that when you enter into that, you feel that you're a part of something much greater and that you're in some way in service of so much more. So some of the stuff that might be self-indulgent and could be left behind does get left behind, but you're still very much a part of the process. You are still very much there. It's almost as if your spirit is one piece in a chorus.
If you have to go looking for it, you're not going to find it.
It finds you, or you meet it halfway.
You cannot find it because it's already in you. But to get to the place where you could recognize, get past all of the intellectualization about it, get past that and find the place that could recognize that spirit is there. It's already there. You don't need to find it. You need to find that part of yourself that will take the interest and the time and the energy to seek it. So there has to be preparation to find it. Many ways for that preparation. I chose art. Another man will choose the church. Another one will go to a Himalaya and sit in a cave. Whatever the way, the search is for what already is established as spirit within the individual.
I always say that photography, for the longest time, was an art, science, and a craft, and now it is just an accessory. You know? So do you think it's made it harder to get to the point that you're talking to, being that it's easier to take the picture now?
It's made harder because people are teaching that the technology is where you get the possibility of a picture. They stress the wrong part of the human psyche. You stress it in the direction of the mechanicalness, and you're going to trip over yourself. So
it's a lot easier to talk about that stuff too.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent.
Oh, yes.
Quantify it.
It's much harder to talk about this,
To qualify. Yeah.
But,
which we try and place that in the service of this.
I have a relation to my materials. I have a genuine relation. When I buy a roll of film off the shelf, it's not a thing in a package. I know there's potential in there.
Yes.
I put it in my camera, light passes through, hits the film. And the process of realizing that these materials are energies. They've been corralled and put into forms that are useful, and we need to do this, that, and the other. But they are live entities. And to be in touch with the fact that it is alive promotes the fact that you're alive. And the more you're alive to it, the closer you get to the possibility of an image that will carry spirit.
Is it safe to assume that you have a hard time relating to a digital image because you can't pick it up and hold it, and you can't touch it because it's electrons that go away as soon as the power's off?
No, not right. This is a new age. It's a new era.
Yeah.
It's a new art.
Okay.
It's developing itself. We have one of the forerunners of helping to understand that the art has to be included in the technology of the matter. So it's not the technology itself, but again, who the artist is, where he's operating from, and can he maintain that state to have his energy buzz off into whatever the materials are. It doesn't matter what the materials are. The result is going to come from an individual who is. It's a process of being. Creativity is. All you have to do is realize, the students would say, I'm having a lot of trouble. I go to the galleries and they tell me my work isn't original enough. I think, oh, really? Give me something different, they say. Give us something creative, something original. I thought, all right, you go back and tell the dealer or whoever, look at the word. The root of the word originality is origin. You find your origin, and you will automatically be in touch with creativity. Then you work.
This is one of the reasons I steer away from the words originality when we discuss this or when I talk about this with my students, and try and shift it over to authenticity, because it gets away from this notion of novelty. And originality could be quite different.
Very good points. Who did you turn to back in the day for inspiration? Who lit your fire? Because there weren't seminars back then, and there weren't podcasts, and there weren't all of the things we have available that we take for granted today. Where did you turn when you were starting out and you needed some guidance or a way of focusing your sparks?
I didn't turn to anybody. I said in my lecture this afternoon, I watched my grandmother make a photograph. I had curiosity, what's that little box? And then I saw another camera with a big glass eye in it. I thought, what is that? So my curiosity goes toward it and sees, oh, it does this and this. But it was my relationship to nature. Nature would throw itself back onto me. It's not a thing out there. I didn't relate to school very well because they were always teaching me about things out there. I needed to be in touch. So I soft-pedaled, or rather ignored, school. Couldn't wait for the bell to ring, run out of the door and go to the ocean, which was close by, and nature. And enough of that, nature said, oh, you saw your grandmother's camera? You should get one like it and try using it. So that's how I began.
How'd you let yourself listen to that, though? How'd you decide not to ignore that when those voices were speaking to you?
He's stubborn.
Huh?
No, that's a goddamn good question. A very, very important question. Sometimes the parents, the teachers of the individual leave him enough alone to be able to experience that he's already there. Then there's this whole school of thought that you have to teach the kid, do this to him, make sure he doesn't do that, get all the rules so he's not heard out there. It's a crapshoot as to who exactly is going to be favored with little pressure and the others that get too much of it. Then there's another school of thought that we come in to a life with something that's already there from a previous life, okay? So
part of it also, I think, is the times. I've listened to the conversations that he's had with the many folks who've visited over the years and watched some of the other photographers. And I think during the 60s and 70s, there was much more of a space made for this. We talked about habits or having a practice. Well, practice is just doing things. Like we have a practice for brushing our teeth. We have a practice for working out. Do we have practices for being spiritual, possibly, but just being? I mean, we got to make a little time. But his colleagues supported that kind of thinking and talked about it. So if you looked at, certainly Minor White was a big influence, but then there was Walter Chappell and Bill Clift and a number of other people who were interested in an inner practice that informed the work, not just craft or the arc of history. They celebrated that internal aspect and they could share it in many ways. There's a rich dialogue, and I personally find it challenging to have that kind of conversation these days. Of course, you can see what I grew up with. Yeah. I'm used to having a lot of it, and it just makes you hungry for more. But when you run into somebody like Michael Kenna, who has a spiritual background and a very vital spiritual practice, though he doesn't consider it religious, even though he was raised that way, you see that that's alive in him, and it's wonderful to encounter people that are working in that activity.
And I think that he and his work stands out because of that. I've seen a lot of amazing photographs in the past 2 days from a lot of very talented, very capable, disciplined practitioners of photography.
Absolutely.
And yet, I was stunned to listen and watch Michael Kenna come through. That is just all the things you just said.
So I was asking myself, when we get in the presence of this kind of stuff, how do we know? And one of the things that I watch for is slowing down, silence, And I was watching my breath change when I was looking at the artifacts this morning. And while I was doing my lecture, as I played the images with the music, I was watching and listening for people's breath and seeing if it changed and when it did and who was reacting. And quite fascinating. If we just watch our breath, if we watch the energy in the room and also the noise, the silence is often very indicative. I think it tells us that we're really present.
Can I ask, regarding your point about, to some degree, parenting and letting a child become themselves, was it fair to say that your father let you become yourself?
I got to say he was absolutely fantastic. And now as a father with a son who has some artistic talent, I keep trying to think like, Dad, what'd you do so right? Because he never once made me feel like he would be prouder of me if I went into this or that I should be like him. But he was always available and appreciative. I think he has just done a sensational job. And I'm still racking my brains to make sure that...
What did I do? I ignored my parents.
Well, at least Nona said, Paul was special, always hiding under the table.
Nice
or
word
walking
for
on the beach.
I truly did not want to be caught into this whole family situation where you do this and you do that and you do that. And I thought, I can't do it. I don't want to. And I literally hid under the table or get off in a corner. I didn't want to be part of the fray. Something in me said, quiet time, quiet.
And this wasn't a bad thing.
No,
no milk and cookies. Quiet time for you.
Please. It's not a timeout, right? Yeah.
It gave me a position of be yourself. Somebody has to, and you're the closest.
And when you were raising John, did you think about this and how you would raise a son, or it just came naturally?
I did not think about it. See, that's the problem. We think that thinking, and they have whole schools of psychological thought that's supposed to raise the kids in a better way by thinking, and they just get more complex. No, he's a live entity. I mean, they brought him out of the hospital, the room where he was born, and held him up to a glass, and I looked at this live entity, now breathing, crying, and my awe of this living thing is what sustained my leaving him be to breathe and develop.
And become.
I was more curious about him than he was.
That might be more encouraging right there. It stems from an attitude and the other stuff flows. They always made space on the fridge. There were Mom's drawings and there were Dad's photographs, and they made space for mine. And the stories that they always embarrass you with, when you were a young boy. This one likes to say, I knew you'd be all right, kid, the day you brought home these 2 drawings of a house. Look what the teacher made me draw. Blue sky, red house, green grass. And look what I drew. Purple sky, magenta grass, and whatever the other color of the house was.
They have color management kits
okay.
out there that could help you with that.
Did they do? Really? At any rate, the celebration of an individual spirit. We all celebrated each other.
And what's common to us is the spirit, so it's a celebration of spirit. How the individual works with it, needs to, has to, that's another matter. But somebody, after the lecture, came to me and chatted and said, and he wanted to know about the influences. And I said, look, influence is incessant. Carry a big shovel. Most of it has to be shoveled away to let the real stuff come through.
Just walk around it, So, yeah, the whole idea of, well, can you just speak a little bit about maybe in your late teens and 20s when you made your decisions, or maybe not then, forgive me for not knowing so much of your biography, to become a photographer and to work that way, how you dealt with finding your own voice? Was it ever an issue?
Yes and no. No, because I've been at it for a long time, making a lot of drawings. But there were definitely questions and definitely searching, and there was a lot of years of working where I felt, doing okay, but I still haven't found what I'm looking for. And I do remember many of the moments where I started to find what I was looking for and really felt like I had come into my own. And perhaps some of this dialogue through my entire life has helped raise an awareness of that, and to be able to know the difference. I don't think photography would have been right for me until Photoshop, even though I was fascinated by, let's say, the metaphoric qualities in Dad's work and the celebration of mystery that's so wonderful. The dreamlike qualities of Jerry Olsman's constructed images were what drew me. And unlike Jerry, I didn't want to work with 8 enlargers and cigars and a lot of blues. And I wanted to work in color, but there was this thing called Photoshop that came along, which was really a dream come true. And it allowed me to blend the painterly and photographic sensibilities together, where straight up photography alone wouldn't have satisfied everything that I wanted to do. Though I still make some straight photographs that work with the rest of the images, and I still appreciate that sensibility and that way of seeing.
Mm-hmm. And did you include your family in your work? Like, for example, when you would go travel somewhere, did they come with you? Did they
That was always
carry equipment around? And
50-50. I mean, there are times when they could come and enjoyed having them. Other times they just couldn't make such a trip. So there was always in and out. But they were always welcome, and there were 3 personalities. I remember an astrologer said, you're all born under the sign of Aries. Not born under, but rather the Aries influences in the chart of each of you. And it denotes that each of you wants to be left alone, an individual. You have your own sense of yourself. So his mother, myself, and himself.
It always did feel like a collection of individuals rather than the typical family unit.
The atmosphere was already
Totally
set up.
It's amazing that it worked.
In that way, it's just a matter of supporting one another.
It starts with acknowledging and respecting. And from that, the other things flow.
Wow. Well, this has been an amazing 2 days, and what an amazing way to end it. Okay, Paul Caponigro, John Paul Caponigro, thank you so much for joining us. It's a treasure to talk with both of you.
Thank you.
I think I could speak for the entire podcast crew to say that this has really been an amazing experience being at the OPTIC conference. We still have one more podcast coming up from OPTIC 2016. Stay tuned for that. For now, take a few moments, rate and review us on iTunes, and tweet us at BHPhotoVideo with the hashtag BHPhotoPodcast. My name is Alan Weitz. Thank you so much for joining us today.